Something changes when you realize you're not safe, not even in your own home. You tell yourself the locks are enough, the walls are enough, that if you just stay quiet, it'll go away. But when the dark feels alive, when the silence is deafening, you know it's already too late. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I swore I could feel it. The figure. Standing at the edge of my bed, waiting, watching. It wasn't just the dreams anymore. It wasn't just my imagination. I knew something was in the house. Morning came too slowly. When the first rays of sunlight finally spilled through the blinds, I felt a sliver of relief. Not much, but enough to get me moving. Enough to make me think, for just a moment, that maybe it was all in my head. Maybe the knocking, the footprints, the whispers, maybe none of it was real. But then my phone buzzed. A message from Tim. Mike's gone. 2 words. Simple, but they hit me harder than they should have. I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, unsure of what to even say. Before I could reply, another text popped up. He didn't come home last night. They found his car, but nothing else. Not even his phone. It's just gone. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Mike was one of the guys who'd talked about the dreams. Who'd talked about what can only be described as the figure. He hid behind humor and joked about it more than anyone else. He said it wasn't a big deal. Said we were all just psyching ourselves out. And now, he was missing, gone never to be seen again. Not Mike. How could this be happening? We went to middle school together. My thoughts were racing. Did the shadow take him? I managed to eventually get a grip on myself. The rest of the day dragged as all I could think about was the figure. At work, every sound felt sharper, every shadow longer. Customers came and went, but I barely noticed. My mind was stuck on Tim's texts, on the dreams, on the footprints that shouldn't have been there, and the whispers. They hadn't stopped. They were quieter during the day, but I could still hear them, just faint enough to make me doubt myself. Tim showed up again that evening, jittery, his face pale as ever. He didn't say much, just grabbed a bottle of water and stood at the counter, staring at me like he was trying to figure out if I was real. "You hear about Sarah?" he finally said, breaking the silence. I frowned. "Sarah? Yeah. She's been having the dreams too." He hesitated, leaning in closer. "But it's worse for her. She says it's not just the whispers anymore. It's talking to her, telling her things. Let it in." I froze. Let it in. He nodded, his voice barely above a whisper now. "She won't say what that means. But she's scared, man. Like, really scared. She said she saw it in the daylight, just standing in her backyard. She called me after it happened. She's not making it up." A chill ran down my spine. The figure, in the daylight. The thought felt wrong, unnatural, like it was breaking some kind of unspoken rule. Dreams are one thing, shadows in the night. But in the daylight, that's not how it's supposed to work. The rest of the shift was a blur. I couldn't focus, couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. I closed up the store early, told myself it was because I needed the rest. But deep down, I knew I was too scared to stay there any longer. When I got home, the house felt strange. The air was heavy, like it was pressing down on me. The kind of feeling you get when you know someone's standing behind you, even if you can't see them. I locked the door, checked the windows, and double-checked them just to be sure. That's when I noticed it. The mirror in the hallway. It was wrong. At first, I thought it was just dirty. A smudge, maybe, or a trick of the light. But when I stepped closer, my reflection didn't move. It just stood there, staring back at me. And then it smiled. I stumbled back, heart hammering in my chest, my mind racing to make sense of what I'd just seen. The mirror was empty now. Just me staring at myself. But that smile, it wasn't mine. I knew it wasn't mine. I didn't sleep that night either. The whispers were louder now, filling the room like static, like they were coming from inside the walls. I tried to drown them out, turned on the TV, blast music on my phone, but it didn't help. They were still there, always there. And then, sometime after midnight, the knocking. Soft at first, just like before. A slow, deliberate rhythm that sent chills down my spine. I stayed frozen in place, my eyes fixed on the door. But this time, it wasn't just the door. The knocks were coming from the walls, from the windows, from the ceiling. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but sit there, paralyzed by the sound. But then the knocking stopped. Just stopped. And in the silence that followed, I heard it. A whisper, right behind me. You'd think you get used to it. The feeling of being watched. That nagging weight of something standing just out of sight. But you don't. You never do. It's like a splinter in your mind, burrowing deeper every time you try to ignore it. And by the time you realize how far it's gone, it's already too late. The morning after the knocking, I sat in my kitchen, staring at my coffee like it held some kind of answer. I hadn't slept, hadn't even tried. The whispers were still there, faint now, like they'd retreated just enough to let me breathe. But I knew they'd be back. They always came back. My phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. I hesitated before opening it. Part of me didn't want to know what she had to say. It's worse at night. I think it's in the house. I hear it breathing. I don't know what to do. I stared at the words, my stomach twisting into knots. She wasn't imagining it. I knew that much. But what could I say? That I was hearing the same whispers. That I'd seen something in the mirror, something that shouldn't have been there. I started typing, then stopped. Nothing felt right. Nothing felt safe. Before I could think too much about it, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Sarah. It was a number I didn't recognize. I dropped the phone, my heart pounding in my chest. The words burned into my mind, simple but loaded, like a command I didn't understand but couldn't ignore. I stared at the screen, hoping it was just some sick joke. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The day dragged on in a haze of paranoia. Every sound felt amplified. Every shadow seemed to move just a little too much. At work, I jumped at the bell on the front door, half expecting to see the figure standing there, waiting for me. But it wasn't the figure. It was Tim. He looked worse than ever, like he hadn't slept in days. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He didn't say anything at first, just walked up to the counter and stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. "It's inside," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze. "What's inside?" "You know," he said, leaning closer. His breath smelled like stale coffee and cheap cigarettes. "It doesn't wait outside anymore. It doesn't knock. It just comes in. And once it's inside, He trailed off, his gaze drifting to the door. It doesn't leave. I didn't know what to say. He was scaring me, but he was also right. The knocking, the whispers, they weren't just outside anymore. They were closer, too close. That night, I locked every door, checked every window 3 times. I even moved the couch in front of the front door, like that would actually stop anything. But none of it helped. The house felt alive, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Around midnight, the whispers started again. Low at first, barely audible, like static on a broken radio. But they grew louder, more insistent, until they were all I could hear. They weren't words, not exactly, but they were familiar, like hearing your name in a crowded room. Soft but undeniable. I tried to block them out, pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't matter. The sound was inside me now, vibrating through my skull. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. And then, the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the doorway, half expecting to see the figure emerge, its faceless form silhouetted against the dim light. But nothing happened. The footsteps stopped, and the silence stretched on, thick and unbroken. I took a shaky step forward, my heart hammering in my chest. My voice sounded small and fragile, like it didn't belong to me. No response. I crept toward the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air grew colder, the kind of cold that settles in your bones and doesn't let go. And then I saw it. The mirror. It was different now. The glass wasn't just reflecting the room anymore. It was dark, impossibly dark, like staring into an open void. And in the center of that darkness, something moved. I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was just there, a shape, a presence, watching me, waiting. The whispers started again, louder this time, more urgent. They filled the room, the air, my head, until I thought I was going to break. And then, for the first time, I heard it clearly. The voice. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The voice wasn't loud, but it was everywhere, wrapping around me like a cold, heavy blanket. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there, frozen in place. But I didn't. I couldn't. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the mirror. The figure in the glass. It smiled. Not a kind smile. Not a human smile. It was something else. Something hungry.